Beautiful. You can have a seat, please. We're going to do something just a little bit different. I think there was a little mistake I didn't catch. We are going to pull out our Bibles from the pew. We're going to be good Baptists today. How about that? So on page 983, it is the letter of Paul to the Colossians. 983. We're going to still be in the first chapter of Colossians, but we're going to look at verses 15 through 23. It's the heading, the preeminence of Christ. So this is a reading from the letter of Paul to the Colossians. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross, of his cross. And you who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. For if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. The word of the Lord. And in all our studies, we would love to have someone come up and read 15 through 23. And then if we could have someone summarize it. We see Karen come into the microphone.
Whoops, I'm stuck. I've got a problem here.
You okay there? You're stuck?
There. My
Okay.
sleeve was stuck to my belt and I couldn't raise my arm. It's a problem.
It's getting harder and harder.
It's hard to get dressed, yes. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you, who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister.
Thank you. Could I have someone summarize that little passage? I see Amy sort of coming, and now she's walking. Good.
This is awfully small print for me. Anyway, well, first, he's talking about Christ being there present at the creation, and that everything was made through him and by him. And then he moves to what, for us, for our personal relationship, that he rescued us from ourselves. And it's through the blood of the cross that we become free and know peace.
Yeah.
I don't know, pretty good.
beautiful. I'm not sure if we had a little background on it, but Colossians is written to the people of Colossae. So my understanding is we don't really know too much about the city because it was destroyed by an earthquake in around 61, 62. So we do think that Paul wrote the letter before the earthquake because there would be nobody there to read it. And so, and then I believe Paul is the writer for the Colossian church. And in the last 200 years, there's been some debate, but I don't see enough evidence to say that he is not the writer of it. And that's my view. You can email me or email Patrick, but anyway, that's what I think.
Not email me.
Well, it could be this. You know, when Patrick was gone last year, there was another COVID outbreak or something like that. So I wrote a little blurb in the email, e-news, but I wrote it under his authority with kind of my idea of what he would say. And so there's part of that I'm writing on behalf of Patrick Gahan. And I think some sense there is in some of Paul's letters like that. There are people who are using Paul's mind and authority to write that. Also, Paul's not a young guy. There are people that are writing for him as he's saying, here's what I want you to say to this church. And they're writing, but I think they're taking, some of their thoughts of that. Anybody have any?
Well, I just don't think it was that unusual in the ancient world. It would not be a diminishment of the person whose name you cited. It would be an honor. I'm as you said, I'm writing this under the man who taught me.
Right.
A big question would be, let's take St. John. I mean, we date his gospel close to the end of the century. And then his letters, perhaps even later, was John able to write all those, or did they all come out of his group of disciples? I mean, we don't know. They are all keep the same type themes, if you'll notice, especially 1 John and the gospel. So I mean,
Yeah.
those are the things that scholars get to question.
Earn their money.
Yeah.
This is a beautiful passage, and the context is also you're in a Roman area. This is Turkey, present-day Turkey, and there are many gods or temples around, and so and the Christians that are there stand out. They're very different from what the society looks like, and so Paul is writing to this group, and I think this is my part before we get into it. That it is a beautiful hymn. It's like the Venite. We just sang the Venite, and it's praising God and talk about who He is and all that. And this is a passage, I think, that comes from earlier times that the church has kind of turned into something liturgical. And when we sing, we just don't recite it. It stays with us way after we've left the worship service. So anyway, what stands out for you in this passage? Something you like, something you didn't like? Don't be shy.
Verse 18, where he says that in everything he might be preeminent. To me it said God did it first, so it's tried and true.
Do you see any echoes in this passage that come maybe from the Old Testament? No? Something maybe from Genesis? Right? From the very beginning. There's somebody there at the very beginning that is creating things. Right? And who is it? You should just have a seat close to the mic, Karen.
Got to get my steps in. I think I liked, and maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but he says he is the image of the invisible God. And I was thinking most of these people probably worship gods that they could see, statues and stuff, and they can't maybe get an understanding of this God that they don't have an image of. And to say that Christ is the image of God, maybe that makes it more understandable,
Yeah.
or more closer, I guess.
What do you think the other images were that other people around?
No, I was thinking about the golden calf and all that they were worshiping, and so they were concrete, visible images of what God was. I don't know what they did before. I mean, with our God, what kind of an image they had of him. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Okay.
In all those other temples and goddesses and gods, they made images, right? But they made it out of what? Gold. Out of their own hands, out of the stuff that was already there. And so there's this view of, even though God is spirit and God is love and compassion and kindness, Jesus is the very image you could hold on to. It's not made of, mud or gold or anything like that. Justin?
I just got back from a journey and a pilgrimage in Europe where we saw a bunch of churches. A lot of them gilded in gold and beautiful, beautiful buildings, incredible buildings. You walk in and you're just awestruck by them. And so this passage kind of pulls me into the reality of I think we so easily could worship the building and the beauty of the space, where we're really called to worship God and God alone. And the building is only a conduit to bring us into that relationship with God. When we start to worship the building, then we're in trouble, I think. And so I was reminded of that, not only from this passage, but then from the journey I just took, that so easily we could get wrapped up in the structures rather than God being the preeminent focus of what our worship is all about.
Yeah. When he says he's made in the image of God, I mean, what does that bring out about God? I mean, well, he's a spitting image of him. What does that mean? Just physically? Yeah, come on, say it. Come on.
That Jesus is the embodiment of God in everything, not just in the way he looks, but in the way he acts, even what he does, and how he lives and how he dies.
Love, grace, forgiveness, justice. Say it again.
Trinity. Do they even talk about the Trinity at the time they were writing the letter to the Colossians?
I don't know the Colossians that well and all that. If he does talk about the Trinity, it's in his mind. I mean, it's not. He's going to talk about the Spirit and things, the Holy Spirit. So it's in his worldview of the Trinity, I believe. What do you think this passage tells us about God and about ourselves? What do you think this passage tells us about God? What do you think this passage is telling even the audience that it's written to about God? Thank you. Karen's getting tired of standing up and walking.
I'll give her a break. Well, the first part of the passage is about the greatness of God and in creation, and just beyond imagination. And then the second half is about that He came for us, and so that's the wonder of it all. That this Creator is mindful of us.
No, that's great.
I think so.
Yeah. What do you think it tells an audience about God that sees within an arm's throw of a rock of seeing temples and statues of God and things like that? And I'll say this. So my brother-in-law, my wife's brother, is a church planter in Taipei, in Taiwan. It has the most Buddhist temples per individuals in the whole of Asia. I mean, and they're not ornate. Some of them are just like a box, like a post office box kind of thing that you can worship at. But it has the most little temples in all of Asia, and all these little symbols of it. But what do you think this letter would resonate with the people in an area where there's so many temples to say of who God is? And how does that translate in our lives?
I think it's saying that God is not a place, right? We can come here and worship God, but we can worship God everywhere. Again, the beauty of this church building and of all church buildings are to draw us into God's presence, but God doesn't mean that God isn't present outside of this space. And so I think it's a great reminder for us that God is with us all the time. And then what does that mean? How we live our lives then truly is about living in response to God's grace and love. And that's not just something we do for an hour a week or a couple hours a week. It's something we do all the time. So for the people of Colossae, I think that would be the message to them is you don't need a temple. You don't need a golden image. You don't need these smaller gods or lesser gods. You need God alone in your life 24/7 all the time in order to truly live into God's calling.
John?
Forgive me for I got here late, so I don't know what's been said. But I'm reading this this letter from Colossians, and you ask about living in a place where there's a bunch of other temples and other religions and things like that. And you know, all the other religions in the world just about are us trying to please a God, doing everything we can to try to please this God so that God will be merciful to us, whether it's the God of agriculture or the God of whatever, you know. And then you read this last thing in this letter. Our God has rescued us from the power of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption and forgiveness of sins. That doesn't say anything about what I had to do to get that. It was just given to me. This is a unique God that we worship. That gives us
that's
a great...
He is unique.
Yeah.
He is like no other.
No other. And what a great gift this is to the people of Colossia and to us. You know, we forget that sometimes. I mean, we worship other gods in our world today, don't we? trying to please the God of wealth or the God of sex or the God of this or whatever. And this is the God that we worship, this God who gives us redemption and forgiveness of sins and welcomes us into the kingdom of his Son.
How many of you are familiar with Samuel Taylor Coleridge? What was his most famous work? Anybody remember?
The Mariner?
Yeah, good for you. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Very good. Good for you.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, the albatross, you've heard you have an albatross around your neck? Well, Coleridge said that we can't understand reality until we come into relationship with Christ. And the reason why he said that is because of the prologue of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God. In the beginning was the Logos, and so forth, of which this writing is in direct relationship. This would have come before first. This would have become before John.
That's right.
John's later than this writing here, but still the same sentiment. And I tend to agree with Scott. It probably was a hymn. You know, it probably was a hymn. But what Paul is saying here is reality was created by the Logos, by Christ. Reality, all of it, not some of it, all of it came through him. And then he goes on to say, reality was construed by a God who will sacrifice himself out of love for people who do not care for him. Okay? That's reality. And this is really, if you think about it, this is a complete change of worldview for anyone who begins to grasp it. Oh, wait a minute. I thought reality was me trying to get to where I needed to get as fast as I could and getting ahead or whatever. That's not reality. That's our twisted idea of reality, but it's not reality. So Paul is saying, no, reality, to really live and see, to be able to see, as Coleridge would say, be able to truly see reality, you have to be in relationship with the one who created it. And then you will begin to realize that true reality, true existence, is being merciful and loving and sacrificial the way that God is. And so, as Paul is writing this letter to some people he doesn't even know, right. I mean, he's writing the Colossians, he didn't even know them, similar to when he writes the Romans. He's saying, unless you come into relationship with the Logos, for you will never, you will continue to stare at a blank wall. You'll never understand reality.
Yeah, that's exactly right. John, sorry, we moved the lesson from 15 to 23, but 14 that you read is one of my favorite passages. And I call it the Star Trek passage because it's like you're in this transporter room, right? And you get transferred and transported from this place of death and darkness into a place of light and of hope and of living in Jesus Christ. It's an amazing transfer. And I think Paul is talking to a group that sees all these other gods around. And if you can imagine, because we live in this world where there's all these other gods we worship, like Patrick was talking about, greed and sex and all that stuff. And we're moved from that darkness and violence into a world in Jesus Christ where there's light and of hope. And he's writing to them because they're still getting mail from the other kingdom of saying, gosh, we sure miss you. Wish you'd come back, right? We have that. I have that every day. I get text messages from the other kingdom all the time. Wish you'd join us again. It's tempting. And Paul is writing saying, no, you now have this forgiveness of sins and this love, and Let me tell you who is preeminent. It's not these handmade golden gods. It's the very Christ who you worship, who has changed you. He is above all other gods. There is no one like him. You don't need to go back. You can try to reconcile. You can try to move yourself into relationship with other people, and it won't work. Why? Because only in Christ, he is the one who is only able to reconcile you and to bring you back from alienation. Why? Because of his blood on the cross for people like me who do not deserve it and who have spit in his face, yet he will do that for us. I find it interesting. We were at the forum. Sorry, I'm going to end it. We were at the forum yesterday, and I read the gospel of Martha and Mary sitting at Jesus' feet, and Martha doing all these other things. Nothing wrong with Martha doing other things at times, but the radical move of Mary to sit at the feet of Jesus. And the lectionary places this gospel, that gospel, with this passage. And I wonder if Mary, maybe she doesn't know, she probably doesn't, but she is sitting at the very feet of the image of the living God, right? The very image of the living God. And the one who was there before the creation of the world, who spoke things into place. She's chosen the right place. And I pray that for all of us, myself included, that we block somehow those texts we get from that kingdom of darkness to say to come back, because we live in the kingdom of light. Amen.